Hello again, hi. I wanted to go back to the Dr. Evans Talk TV interview. I haven't done a section on that for a while, I'm still working through it. So this would be part 7, I think. Oh my God, part 7. But by way of an introduction, I wanted to bring your notice to, if you haven't seen them, a few different videos and links. The first one being on a YouTube channel, and I'll link it below. The YouTube channel is called Lucy Letby, The Case for Innocence. So there's a lot of really good short videos on there, a lot about the trial. You know, there's a series of 3 videos which are to do with Ben Myers' summing up, for example. A lot to do with the communications between Lucy Letby and Dr. A and other nurse colleagues at the time. This particular one, which was put up about 23 hours ago, it says, the title of it, and I'll link it below, is called Dr. Fiona McRae Speaks About the Bullying She Experienced at the Countess of Chester Hospital. She really goes into some detail about the culture of bullying, not now, but at the time she was there, which is the same, it crosses over the same time that Lucy Letby was there. The bullying from other clinicians. I think she's an anaesthetist, I believe, from memory, but she's a clinician. So it's bullying from her colleagues, it's bullying from the management, she's seeing and witnessing bullying going in all directions. Well, not upwards, but you know, always either on a level or downwards. So that's really worth watching. It's about 9 minutes long, so I recommend that. The second video I'd really recommend to you was flagged up to me by a Twitter user called Dr. Lulu, who's a legal professional who teaches law. And it's in relation to the case of Colin Norris, which I've mentioned before. He was a Scottish nurse working at a hospital in Leeds who was convicted of murdering 4 elderly patients and attempting to murder a 5th using insulin. Now his case has just been referred to the Court of Appeal via the CCRC, but he's been in prison since 2008, I think it is. So this video, which I really recommend you watch, it's about 27-28 minutes long. It's a panorama video. It is done well. It is done well. The reporter does a good job on this. And this video, I'll link it below, is called The Innocent Serial Killer, ? Panorama. So it's about the Colin Norris case. And it's about the evidence that, subsequent to the case, really makes it look very, very unsafe. Incredibly unsafe. They even interview a juror that was one of the decision makers in the original trial, and he says, had I seen this new evidence with regard to insulin and the possible conditions that some of the alleged victims had, he would have voted different. He would have given a different judgment. He would have given a not guilty judgment. Whether there'll be a knock-on effect, depending on the timing of this, if as and when Colin Norris has his appeal in respect of Lucy Letby, we're yet to see. But what's really fascinating, there's so many parallels between this and the Lucy Letby case. One that's very startling and salient is that in the case of Colin Norris, his defence barrister made the same absolute categorical error of having the agreed fact that yes, there was deliberate insulin poisoning, it just wasn't Colin Norris. Disaster. And that's exactly what Ben Myers did as well. The same agreed fact. Yes, somebody had tampered with the TPN bags in the case of Lucy Letby, but it wasn't her. And the juries just don't go with that because they're being asked to believe, oh, well, there's another, oh, God, they're on shift all the time, but there's another murderer somehow. It's a disastrous thing to do. You can only conclude they're either just don't know what they're doing, these defence counsels, or there's something worse afoot involved. So yeah, that's another one I'd like to recommend to you. I'll link that below. And the third thing is an article which I've linked before and talked about and read from before in another video. It's a really good article from the Principia Scientific, principiascientific.com, and it's quite a long article, but brilliantly laid out in terms of the chronology, written by Professor Gloria Moss. And just going back to that doctor who's talking about the culture of bullying, you'll see a piece in there, I think I read it out before anyway, is that the chief executive that took over from Chambers, who was the chief executive at the time that Lucy Letby was there and was supporting her, was a lady called Dr. Susan Gilby. And she gets appointed in 2018. And by 2022, she's saying she has to leave because of alleged bullying, you know. She's claiming constructive dismissal. So it's going on. It hasn't disappeared. It's ongoing. So that just gives you a sense, and just another sense as if you need any more, because it's obvious it's right through that organisation, year on year on year. Before the time of Lucy Letby, all the time during, and then since. So I'll link that below again, just in case people haven't seen that article. I really recommend a read of that. It's really very, very clear and very well set out. So back now to the Dewi Evans Talk TV interview, because I transcribed the whole interview onto a file. So I probably won't play his voice. I know you're going to miss hearing his dulcet tones, but we won't have it for this. So I'm re-engaging with it now at 8 minutes 54, where the interviewer, Talk TV interviewer, asks Evans. She says, "Well, we've talked about what processes were in place at the hospital regarding, could the alarm been raised sooner in terms of what you were looking at, i.e. Evans, and investigating. Do you think the methods that she used to abuse or kill these babies were sophisticated enough that it meant that it was quite difficult to identify what it was that meant these children had died?" It's a bit of a ham-fisted question, isn't it? But anyway, you get the gist. Evans says, I put in here, I try to make little notes about how I'm perceiving him in terms of his attitude, facial and things like that, and his energy. I put here smug and gloating. That's how it struck me. See what you think for his answer to that question. And Evans answers, "Oh, she was an extremely clever criminal. He stumbles there. She almost got away with it. And they may well deny it, but for the consultants actually pressing and demanding that the police get involved. I think she would have got away with it, but for that. Because I'm sorry to say that although it's no surprise to me, although it's shocking to everyone else, the default position of NHS managers when things go wrong is the cover-up. And I think they tried quite hard to cover up criminal activities, and I'm glad they failed to get away with that." This is a classic thing he does. This is one of the most egregious, awful examples of what he does when he at that point in time, he's accusing them of knowingly covering up criminal activity before anyone had looked at any medical notes. He hadn't looked at them. He hadn't established whether there was criminal activity. According to the police operation, they were going there with an open mind, not to know, hoping it was a bug in the water, all that kind of nonsense. But he's injected the present, subsequent to the trial, the conviction, back into that time, and is accusing that management of knowing that Lucy Letby was in the process of murdering baby after baby after baby, attacking baby after baby after baby, knowing it, deliberately covering it up. And what's more, obviously, they went on to offer her funding for an MA and to send her to Alder Hey to get some extra training, while knowing that she was a murderer. That's what Evans is saying. Isn't that the most outrageous thing? Isn't that the most outrageous thing? But it shows and reveals again, as if you need any more examples of this, what kind of person he is. He's an accuser, isn't he? He's accusing them of knowing that she was murdering at that time, the management, knowing it and deliberately covering it up. Does it make any sense? Of course it doesn't. Well, it makes sense in his world, because only he can discover who the murderers are, retrospectively, from a bunch of shabby notes. Only he can do that. Even the interviewer, even this sort of stock media character, is alarmed by what he's just said there. The accusation that management knew before the police were even involved, before Evans even looked at a medical note to make his judgment, because he was supposed to be going in there, remember, with an open mind to decide, well, he didn't know if there's any crimes at all. He didn't know anyone was involved, didn't know if there's any crimes. He can have it that way, but he can accuse retrospectively the management of knowing there's a murderer there before there's any investigation. Can you see what kind of character we're looking at here? I know you can. I know you can. The interviewer, even the media, the mainstream media sort of stock character says, obviously the hospital aren't here to defend themselves. There is a statement from the hospital we can bring out. They don't do that. Then what happens, there's a segue, I don't think I'll cover this in this video, with Hughes. I won't do the impression again in a minute. He talks a lot of crap for a couple of minutes, but it's not crap because it's really serious, because it's about him, obviously in conjunction with Evans, trying to find more murders, more attacks retrospectively, looking through all 4,000 of them, and it's horror heaped upon horror of lies. So that's Hughes doing his little bit there. We cut away from that segue with Hughes, from that section, I should say. Sorry about the squeaky chair here. The interviewer, back to Evans, says to Evans, asks him, because of Lucy Letby's sophisticated methodology, how difficult is it going to be to identify whether an investigation is needed? And she's referring to what Hughes was talking about in terms of these further back cases, that they want to look through all 4,000 babies that Lucy Letby had some tangential or interaction with at some level since 2012. Evans replies, well, the investigation's ongoing. I'm not involved with the subsequent investigation. I've drawn a line under my medical legal practice following the case. I'll break off there, because as we know, he very soon changed his mind, because more money was on the table, more kudos, more fame for him. So he changed his mind, got back in the saddle, and was party to some of those articles that came out in the national newspapers where he says, oh, up to 257 babies could have been harmed by Lucy Letby. He's a nutter. Let's cut to the chase. The guy's a nutter. He's an absolute nutter. And a vindictive, nasty nutter. So he says he was going to back out of it, but he obviously hasn't. He says, I've been involved with paediatrics for 50 years. Well, that's 50 years too long as far as I'm concerned. And so I think it's time to stop. Once you start thinking about what happened, and then I don't think it's that difficult. This is Evans speaking. I don't think it's that difficult. And I hope this doesn't sound blasé, but the first baby I saw who had collapsed unexpectedly, and this is back in November 2017 when I filed my report. He's mixing time up again because obviously the baby is related to 2015. He's mixing up the event that happened, the collapse, with his report. They're synonymous to him, as though he was there. And he wasn't there. He's just looking at, as he'll say later on here, very shabby notes, all out of order. But he talks about it as though he witnessed it. And what he's witnessing is looking at a bunch of shabby notes with a very fixed idea about what something is and not engaging with any other possibilities. Because he's not a scientist. I don't know what he is. Well, a witch hunter in that way. You know, he's a nutter. The guy's a nutter. And this is back in 2017 when I filed my first report, he says. I thought, oh my God, this baby's collapsed as a result of a circulation of injected, then he stumbles, of air injected directly into the veins. And that was baby A in this trial. In this trial. Oh, the trial, yeah. And that was baby A in this trial, okay. And his twins suffered the same fate, although the twins survived. And it's really a matter of excluding the usual cause of collapse in babies, such as infection, hemorrhage, or some kind of peculiar congenital problem. And one could easily exclude those, Evans says. And in addition to this one, also found, and he stumbles a lot, he says, in addition to this, the only explanation was the injection of air into the circulation. And then, having prepared my preliminary report on the first few babies, I've got to go back and unpack this. There's a lot in here. More evidence came of some peculiar discoloration that these babies had suffered, which has been associated with air embolus in other cases. And this reinforced my initial opinion and, of course, reinforced the diagnosis. There's a lot to unpack there. So he starts off talking about, you know, he's not going to be involved anymore, but then he obviously is. He does a 180, can't resist the money, can't resist the fame, can't resist the kudos, thinks he might have another chance at politics, probably. He's loving the interviews, he's loving everybody wanting to speak to him, visit him in his home. He says, well, what did he say? The first baby I saw who collapsed unexpectedly. Yeah, I've done that bit about the time aspect. This is baby A. Yeah. And he says he's done this before, but he says it's really a matter of excluding the usual cause of collapse in babies, such as, and he lists the three main causes, according to him, infection, hemorrhage, or some kind of peculiar congenital problem. Well, the babies, all of them, all of those first four babies were suspected for sepsis. All of them, which is infection. So he's excluded all the other ones as being explainable infection. We can intuit, we can infer from what he's saying, explainable infection. But he's choosing these special ones as, yeah, you can see there's infection there, but it's not explainable. But the collapse isn't explainable. Where there are other cases, he can discount, and you know what those cases are. They're ones where Lucy Letby is not involved, because he can't use them. He can't use a single one of them. Because if he uses a single one of them, the whole story's over. If he uses a single case where Lucy Letby's not involved, but there's been a crash due to sepsis, which he's recognising is one of the major issues, then who's the murderer then? Where's the murderer? Who is it? Or is it sepsis for all of them? Is sepsis playing a part in practically all these cases? And other issues as well. But sepsis is one of the main through lines of all this, you know, one of the main motifs across all the babies. So you can see what he's doing there. He's revealing himself again. He's revealing the poverty of his methodology, which there is no methodology. And the reason there's no methodology here, and he reveals it to you, is that he knew who was in the frame and he knew which cases he had to choose. He knew that those doctors suspected those cases and the police suspected those 15 cases, and he delivered them. He echoed it back to them. He tells it like he discovers it, and then they discover, oh my God, we didn't realise who would be on rota for those 15 cases that you chose as suspicious. Oh my God, it's actually Lucy, the one we've been suspecting for 2 years. And the one that the police are suspecting, who said, well, we might arrest her, we could have arrested her. They all know. They all know everything that each other knows. All of them. The three elements, the triumvirate. Police, consultants, and this bastard. So continuing to go over that bit again. He says, and one could easily exclude those. It's so easy for him to exclude those. But he said, in addition to this, one also found, and he stumbles a lot, in addition to this, the only explanation was the injection of air into the circulation, because he didn't look at any other possibilities, didn't consider sepsis for any of those cases. even though he's considering sepsis for the other cases he rejects as being explainable. And this is another important point, I think, that he goes on to say, and having prepared my preliminary report on the first few babies. Now that strikes me as strange, because I thought his report was for the full 15. So is he suggesting there that he comes back with the first 4? Which again is an echo of what Brewery's done back in 2015. Which suggests to me that he's got the heads up from Brewery about what the passage of investigation has been, what the groupings were, and the order of them. He's gone back and he's just reflecting Brewery's report back, so that Brewery goes, yeah, Evans can see that there was a problem back with babies A to D. This is odd. This is the first time he's given away here, that he's done this sort of preliminary report of only the 4 babies. That's what he seems to be saying. Prepared of the first few babies, yeah. That's really odd, that, because isn't he meant to be going all through all 32 and then whittling them down to 15 and then sending that report of the 15 back? But here it seems to be he's working on a subset of the 4, which all happen to be the ones that Brewery was concerned about. Just by chance, though. Just by chance. It echoes Brewery's concerns from 2015. Not that they had any words or anything, or that Brewery told the police and the police told Evans. None of that. And nobody knows, Evans doesn't know who Lucy Letby is, doesn't even know that there is a suspect. So he says. And he goes on to say, more evidence came of some peculiar... More evidence came. It came. Where did it come from? More evidence came of some peculiar discoloration that these babies had suffered, which had been associated with air embolus in other cases, and this reinforced my initial opinion and, of course, reinforced the diagnosis. So this new evidence is coming. Where's that coming from, if it's not in the medical notes that he's looking at? Because what we've got here, and what was shown at the trial, is that a nurse and several of the doctors start talking about a rash and describing it with this refreshed memory 7 years down the line that didn't match A, in many cases, their police interviews, and B, didn't match what they had in the medical notes. But 7 years down the line, they got this refreshed memory of this very particular type of rash, which coincides with Evans' sponge-like brain, as he calls it, of his own brain, sponge-like, remembering this 1987 paper in which air embolus is linked to this rash that comes and goes, this purpura that comes and goes across the abdomen, different parts of the body. But he describes it here as evidence came. And if it's not in the medical notes, how has it come to him? By what means? By divine intervention? Or has somebody had to tell him that? Has somebody had to tell him that? One of these consultants has had to say, or the doctors say, well, yeah, there's this as well. We know we didn't put it in the medical notes, but there's that as well. Otherwise, why would he find it? Let's say he has got it in some of the notes. He's certainly not in all the notes, because what happens in the trial is that the defence reveals to the court that the description of this rash is different for different people. Some people don't notice it at all. It's just, for me, it's another real clue that there's interaction. Evans describes it. He's in Wales somewhere. He doesn't know about Lucy Letby. Doesn't know any of the consultants. He's like this, got clinical purity and distance, analytical objectivity. But it's not true. He knows much, 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 much more ongoing, bit by bit by bit. They drip feed him. And I think he knew even before the police were involved. Got to prove it. He's utterly corrupted in this role, I believe. And back to the rash idea, is that also can be a sign of sepsis as well. That can be a sign of sepsis, which of course he don't want to look at. But he will look at sepsis if it's a case that doesn't involve Lucy Letby, and he'll consider that as an explainable and expected crash or death. How does he manage to just find the cases where sepsis is involved. And doesn't he even ask himself, why is this sepsis happening? Where's it coming from? And I'm looking at the notes. Why isn't he thinking to himself, I'm looking at the notes of the ones where I think there's intended harm, but there's sepsis there as well. Do I need to rule that out then? Do I need to challenge my idea about the embolus because there's sepsis there? He doesn't do it. And this is why getting his reports, which are going to be a dog's dinner and a basket case, it would reveal the complete fraud that he is, but they're not publicly available. I don't think they're going to become publicly available. The defence obviously have them, because they have them in discovery, and don't they? You know, they've got the right to see them. We want to see this charlatan's workings out, don't we? Not only for the babies that he says that there was intended harm, but almost as important, if not more in a sense, in terms of the arguments here, about how he blithely and easily, as he keeps saying, it's very easy to do the explainable ones. Very easy to do them. I know I've said this before, but it's the problem, isn't it? And because we don't have access to that, and he's not put, and I don't think it happened in the trial. I've not seen the full trial script. We haven't got an opportunity. I don't think in the trial, the defence or anyone started to analyse how the cases that he said were explainable, and that would have needed to have happened to take apart his fake methodology, empty, unscientific methodology. He continues speaking now, Evans, in this Talk TV interview. I'll read it now. The diagnosis of milk being injected into the stomach was far easier. Baby G was a baby who was on 45 millilitres of milk every 3 hours, which is not a large volume of milk. And when the nurse looking after this baby went for her break, Lucy Letby come in and must have given this poor baby a huge amount of milk, or milk and air, down a syringe. This led to the stomach blowing up, you know, becoming enlarged. This interfered with the breathing and the baby collapsed, and that baby vomited across the whole of the nursery. And as well as vomiting all over the nursery, the nurse still aspirated 45 millilitres from the stomach. So you can't vomit all over a nursery when you've only been fed 45 millilitres. Then he smiles, Evans, and tilts his head from side to side, and he seems happy, that's my perception, and very pleased with himself and smug. And then he goes on to say, and there are still 45 millilitres still left there. It was clear that this baby had been injected with milk, or milk and air. And that occurred in other babies as well. And some babies have suffered having milk or milk and air injected into their stomach, as well as being, and he kind of pulls a strange face and stumbles and says, as well as being killed by an injection of air into the venous circulation. I want to sort of look at that in detail, that section, of course. And after that, read out a really good comment that was sent, that was put on a previous video to do with the Talk TV series of videos, analysis, by the YouTube account Tequila Mockingbird. And I'll read that out after I've done the bit that I was going to say, taking it line by line. So the diagnosis of it. So we've got to remember at this time that the notes are incredibly shabby in terms of who knows whether there were other. Who knows who gave that baby milk? Who knows? I mean, we've got a certain amount probably on the notes there. There could be stuff missing there. There could have been someone who thought the baby hadn't been given the milk. Could be another nurse coming through. Somebody said, "Oh, can you just do the feed for me because I'm going on my break?" How do we know it was Lucy Letby? He seems to know, because it's got to be her. It's always got to be her. How do we even know that? We don't know that. It's his inference, and he describes it in such a way. He says, and she must have done it. That's not the same as that she did do it. Him saying she must have done it. It's not the same. This isn't a scientific approach. This is just like somebody in the blame game, really, just looking for somebody to blame for everything that goes wrong, which is simply an echo of what this gang of 4 consultants have done for 2 years before this clown gets involved. So you've got this nurse going on a break, and the Lucy Letby allegedly coming in, putting all this huge amount of milk, a huge amount of milk. Nothing scientific about that statement. And it becomes enlarged. This interferes with the breathing, okay? Again, you're not looking at the sepsis issues going on here. You're not looking at how that can cause vomiting as well, or NEC, necrotizing enterocolitis, how that can cause vomiting. And these babies have got these issues potentially, and it's queried in their notes. But he doesn't go there. He never talks about that. He can't. That's why we need to see his notes. And we need to put him on the stand and say, well, what was your methodology for pushing sepsis and neck out of the NEC out of the window, and just to leave it with your pet theory here? What was it? What's the methodology? Should be torn apart on the stand. Torn apart. And I keep saying he talks again like he's there, like he's actually witnessed it in his eyes, but he's looking at bits of paper which are all over the shop according to him, all very shabby. He's looking at those. And this phrase, the vomited, you've got a tiny baby there, probably less than a kilogram, very, very tiny baby, vomiting across the whole of the nursery from inside an incubator. Does that sound like an exaggeration? Why would he use that kind of extreme language? That the baby's got the ability to vomit across the whole of a nursery, a whole room, a tiny baby in an incubator, as opposed to being sick in the incubator itself or onto the clothes around the baby and on itself. Vomiting all over the nursery. And he repeats it, so you can't vomit all over a nursery. That doesn't... What notes is he using that to use that kind of inflammatory language, that like the inaccurate language? It's obviously, it wasn't all over the walls and all over right in that corner and over there. It's a large room. It's not true what he's saying. And there's a reason for him exaggerating that. He's got to exaggerate it. He's got to be storytelling. Because he knows how weak his evidence. There's no evidence there. It's a story. Everything he's telling us is a story. Everything he tells the court and the jury is a story. Everything. His whole role in this is a storyteller for the police and for the consultants and for the NHS, to effectively stop the negligence claims because of all the sepsis running riot through that hospital. Is it possible? Is it possible that that individual baby had 2 feeds given to the baby? But why does it have to be Lucy Letby? How do we know that? There's all these unnamed nurses around as well, but we never get to know who they are. Just because Lucy Letby comes into the room doesn't mean she actually gives an extra amount of milk, if an extra amount of milk was given. And we've only got the notes to believe in. Why should we always believe in what these notes say? I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of pages of care home notes in all sorts of contexts. A lot of them aren't accurate. A lot of them are just generalisations. Some of them are made up, frankly. Some of them are made up for all kinds of reasons. These are being treated as though they are synonymous with what literally happened. So the idea that somebody's written in a note, it was all over the nursery, and it wasn't. A tiny little baby, like less than a kilogram or about a kilogram in weight, in an incubator, and it's vomiting all over the walls and the ceiling and across. It's not happening, is it? It's not really happening like that. So that gives you a sense of how those notes can be distorted. So if they can be distorted like that, what makes us believe about the 45 millilitres of aspirate? Well, that might be the case. It might be that the baby was sick, and I'm not denying that possibility, but it's exaggerated to the nth degree to create this horror scene because Lucy Letby happens to be in the room. You've got to create this fictional horror scene. And an extra amount of milk, a double amount, could have been erroneously given by any other nurse, that nurse who was going off duty ask to do that, or that nurse could have done it accidentally herself. If these nurses are dealing with sometimes 2 up to 3 babies, they might make mistakes, and they might give a feed twice. It's happened in some of the other notes where there's been a medication of a saline. There's been certain medications which have been given twice, and there's issues to do with the record keeping, in that people are saying they've witnessed something they haven't witnessed, whether it's nurses or doctors, and they're writing notes retrospectively, that things that happened 3 or 4 hours before. When you've got that kind of situation going on, you can't take these notes as an absolute 100% verbatim of what happened in reality. And this line, it just stands out like a sore thumb. There's vomiting all over the nursery, all over it. It's exaggeration to tell a story, to create a horror scene that Lucy Letby is responsible for. And this statement he makes, he said that baby, the one that was sick, had been injected with milk and air. Well, which one is it then? If you don't know which one it is, why are you making those two why are you giving those 2 options? What kind of level of scientific analysis and rigour is there? He doesn't even know what he just say, oh, well, it's one of them. It's just what he thinks, isn't it? It's just what's come to his mind he's serving a purpose. He's not serving a purpose. He's serving a purpose to get someone convicted, to get a court case happening down the line, to get convictions, to get someone in prison. He's serving that purpose. He's not a independent person. He's being paid by the police. He's doing a job of work for the police. I'm going to read this really brilliant comment that was on part 4 of this series about the Talk TV interview with Dewi Evans. And this comment was from Tequila Mockingbird 532. That's the handle, the YouTube handle. I'll read it now. This is Tequila Mockingbird's comment. Lucy's apparent method of murder and attempted murder, according to the Chester police, the prosecution, Dewi Evans and the judge, was, quote, extremely clever, calculated and methodical, close quote. And without arousing suspicion, she, quote, went through each case clinically, close quote. The Talk TV interview spoke about, quote, just how sophisticated her methodology was, close quote. And so Tequila Mockingbird goes on. Okay then, here's Dewi Evans describing Lucy's method of murder and attempted murder on that same Talk TV interview. Quote, the diagnosis of milk being injected into the stomach was far easier. Baby G was a baby who was on 45 millilitres of milk every 3 hours, which is not a large volume of milk. Lucy Letby came in and must have given the baby a huge amount of milk or milk and air down a syringe. This led to the baby's stomach blowing up and becoming enlarged. This interfered with breathing and the baby collapsed. That baby vomited across the whole of the nursery. Tequila Mockingbird has put that in capitals, again, because it's obviously exaggeration. That occurred in other babies as well, and some babies suffered milk and air injected into their stomach, close quote. So, Tequila Mockingbird goes on. So, I have questions. 1. Why, if Lucy wanted her murder method to not arouse suspicion and be relatively undetectable, would she start injecting large volumes of milk into babies when the result would mean projectile vomiting across, quote, the whole of the nursery, close quote? Not exactly subtle, is it? Wouldn't doctors and nurses immediately start wondering where all this extra milk coming out of the baby was coming from? Number 2, why, after baby G's massive projectile vomiting, would Lucy Letby have repeated and continued to use this method of murder, as Evans states she did, when she now knew for sure that large projectile vomits would be the potential reaction? I thought she wanted to be above suspicion. Haven't we been told that she's the Mensa of serial killers, extremely clever and intelligent, going to great lengths to divert any possible suspicion of her? Yet here she is, in a vomit-filled nursery room, an unusual event that was no doubt discussed on the ward, and she tries it again and again. And that's the end of the comment from, which I thought was brilliant, from To Kill a Mockingbird. It just goes to the absurdity of it, the unbelievability of it, the absurdity of it. And yet Evans will try to make you believe any absurdity. Absurdity heaped upon absurdity. Reading that comment out from To Kill a Mockingbird 532, it struck me, the way that that's been put there, is that, well, at that time that happened, why didn't anybody say, why is there so much milk coming out of the baby? Why is there so much vomit? We need to check how much milk the baby's had. At that time, not talking about years down the line when Evans starts looking down at the notes. Why wasn't it investigated then? Why wasn't it if it was, as they said it was, this huge amount of milk, why wasn't it the source and cause of an investigation in that unit then that had to lead to an answer to that question, if there was so much milk, about who had given the feeds? Why didn't it happen then? Is it possible that it's so exaggerated that it's possible there was a double feed, like 90 millilitres was given, or the vomiting was exaggerated and the vomiting was due to neck or sepsis or some other cause, nothing to do with the amount of milk per se? It's these notes are being relied on that he's drawn from, and we haven't seen these original notes that he's looking at. We'd like to see those to see what contradictions there might be there. But the salient question is, well, if that was the case, why wasn't it looked into then by the consultants? Why wasn't it an investigation at the time? Back to the Talk TV interviewer, there's a bit of a break and the interviewer goes through the intros again and says what Lucy Letby has been convicted of. And then she asks him, she says, when you were looking at your information and reports, Dr. Evans, you're speaking with real conviction now about what you believe was the cause of death in these babies. And Evans nods. He goes, yeah. He said, and she goes, the interviewer goes, was there moments when you thought, is this cast iron? Any moments of doubt for you? And there's a really long pause before Evans answers. Well, quite a long pause. He's thinking. He's thinking about how to deal with this politically. How's he going to answer this? He says the following: I think you need to keep it simple if you're a clinician. He wasn't actually registered with the GMC at the time, but anyway, that's another point. And he's retired for a number of years and was never a neonatologist. Anyway, I'll put that to the side. I think you need to keep it simple if you're a clinician. And I couldn't think of another cause, quite frankly. They keep giving themselves away, don't they, these characters? I couldn't think of another cause. Does that sound scientific? I couldn't think of one. I just couldn't think of it. Didn't think of it. Not I went through a rigorous methodology to rule out, to challenge my hypothesis, and to rule out infection, to rule out NEC, to rule out any other issues that the baby might have had, to look at the other babies and why were they being suspected of sepsis, to look at the pattern here. He just couldn't think of another reason. Can you hear and see and feel how weak that is? I just couldn't he's telling you what his methodology is there. I thought of this. I thought that's the answer. And when she goes, well, is it cast iron? Well, it's cast ironness for him is that he couldn't think of anything else. Couldn't think of anything else. That's the nature of it being cast iron for him. Nothing else occurs to him. Doesn't with any kind of rigour rule out anything else and show and describe and says why and what basis he rules out the other possibilities. So he says there, yeah, I couldn't think of another cause, quite frankly, yeah. Thanks for being frank, Evans. I was aware, this is him going on, I was aware that the police, and then he stumbles, interesting point to stumble. I was aware that because the police were involved, that some criminal activity was suspected. Oh, really? I thought the police were going in there just looking potentially, it could be anything or anyone, it could be a bad bug in the water. I thought you, Evans, was Well, you don't know what it is. You don't know if anyone's suspected. But now it's changing a little bit, isn't it? Now he thinks, well, that somebody is suspected here. In other words, he's got in his mind, he's acknowledging that he's looking for a murderer before he starts. He's not looking to analyse what's happened to these babies. He's looking for intended harm, and then he'll find it. He'll find it because that's what he's looking for. And he's precisely not looking for other reasons that cause the crashes or the deaths of the babies. Because he knows someone's suspected. And I believe 100% he knows who it is. In the cases, I've said this before, in the cases that he chooses, the 15 from the 32, the other ones are all easy to dismiss, apparently. Apparently, we don't know his workings out. In those 15 cases, he's seeing the same nurse's name over and over and over again to the exclusion, or so many more times than anyone else's name there in terms of and he's not looking for a doctor's name. We know he's not looking for a doctor's name. We know he's looking for a nurse. He's not looking for a cleaner or an admin person. He's looking for a nurse. And he knows that nurse isn't there anymore, because it goes back to that light bulb moment I had when I said, well, there's no concern there. There's no concern there to say, God, is she still working on the ward? We've got to get her out. We've got to make sure, whatever you do, make sure she's not on the ward still. Or is she transferred to another hospital? Let them know. Let them know that there's a problem there. Doesn't need to be concerned, because he knows who she is and he knows where she is, as the police do. As the police tell us they do, from day one. As the consultants know. You see how they all join up, these three elements. They might as well be one. They've got a single front and a single direction of flow about what they're trying to achieve, all of them, while pretending there's this kind of clinical approach, which is bollocks, absolute bollocks. He goes on, obviously, I had to block that thought out. Well, yeah, it's like telling someone that don't think of a pink elephant. He hasn't blocked it out, has he? He can't block it out, because he knows it. He's not meant to know it. He's not meant to know there's a crime at all. He's meant to be clinical. He keeps saying he's clinical. I'm clinical. Clinical approach. You've got to block it out, though. But he knows so much more, and he can't block it all out because he knows what job he's there to do. He knows who those consultants have been suspecting for 2 years. He knows who the police are suspecting. He's got a job to do. And that's to ratify the suspicions of the consultants. And that's why he chooses those 15 from the 32 cases. He goes on in his inimitable style. He goes on and says, which is why I told the police not to name any suspect. That's the elephant in the room again. See, I'm not meant to be a suspect, is there? I'm meant to be looking, could be bad bug in the water. Why have you got a suspect if it could be a bad bug in the water? Hey, why have you got one? Why have you got one? Which I told the police not to name any suspect, even if they had a suspect. Oh, even if it's just playing at innocence, playing at the lack of knowledge that you so obviously had. And so, he says, to use the jargon, and it is jargon for him, I approached it in a very clinical way. See, that's one of those thought-stopping cliches. You meant to go, it's clinical. Oh, what you did was clinical. Oh, in that case, it's all above board then. It's all true. It's perfect. The fact that you didn't even consider the sepsis issue, but because you're doing it, you've told us you're doing it in a clinical way. Oh, well, there's nothing to worry about then. We've got 100% reliance on your methodology, Evans, because you're saying it's clinical. You use that word, that like a spell. Say the word clinical, and it means it's all real and right and just and intelligent and rigorous. No, it isn't. It's just one single word to cover up the basket case and the fraud that this character is. Much more ongoing need to persuade here from Evans as he goes on to say, I only had access to the notes. Yeah, right, yeah, only had access to the notes. Yeah, you knew a lot more than that. And he says the notes were electronic copies prepared by the Chester NHS and given to the police. Well, there's a problem there. There's a problem there because the police say that the notes were given by the NHS to them, and that the officer says they arrived as though the files were thrown up in the air and landed on the ground. Does that sound like electronic copies from the NHS, or does it sound like physical photocopies? It's photocopies, isn't it? That's what they told us in that hummingbird video that you can't see anymore. And Evans gets electronic copies, but the only way that can happen is if the police scan all those physical copies in and send them electronically to Evans. But then there's another contradiction, because one of the detectives in that hummingbird video said, we brought Evans the notes. And that's a physical thing. You bring them. You don't send somebody an email. You don't send somebody all electronically stuff and say you brought them to them. So that they can't get their stories straight. They can't get their stories straight about how those notes got from 1 to 1 to 1. The 3 points. You know, somebody at the hospital had to photocopy those notes. They wouldn't give the originals out. Send the photocopies to the police. Police scan them in and send electronic copies to him, because he keeps saying he's got electronic copies. But all their stories are all clashing. They're clashing, and it matters. It really, really matters. He goes wittering on now, and he says, you know, many of the notes, pause, were organised, and then he glares at the camera, disgracefully, you know, not in date order. Things were upside down. I had to print a lot of them out. Oh, poor Evans, you had to print them out, did you? To simply make sense of them. Oh, God, so these are the notes that you're judging somebody's life on, judging all these crimes on, and you had to print them out to make sense of them. Did you make sense of them, though? If you can't make sense of them on the screen, what does printing them out help you make sense? How much more knowledge have you got from printing them out, from looking at them at the screen? What level of sense has increased from doing that? It's all basket case stuff, isn't it? He's revealing what he is. It's ridiculous. Absolutely, he's a ridiculous individual. He's going for the NHS management again here, where he says, you know, they're disgraceful, they're upside down, I had to print them out. So both the police had to put up with, you know, shabby support from NHS management. Kick that management again, because he's obviously had a history of that in his own career. And he says, and he thinks to himself, Evans, and he says, each case, Evans says, I looked at each case individually, and I think for certain the 7 murder convictions and the convictions for attempted murder, if it was only one case, I think there was sufficient to explore and investigate it from a criminal point of view and possibly charge someone. Oh yeah, really, you wouldn't got any of those cases through individually through the CPS, let alone a conviction at trial. It was a mass coagulation of a lot of utterly weak, tendentious, pathetic cases all jammed together to overwhelm a jury. That's what you did. You couldn't have done it, and you said it before in this interview. We had the smoking gun of the insulin cases found by Brewery a year later. None of these air embolus ones would have hacked it on their own. None of this theory of the air embolus would have worked. None of it. It's only the insulin cases that are found by Brewery a year later, which are completely suspect in terms of that testing. He had nothing, and there he's making the claim here as though every individual case could have had enough to get through the CPS and through a trial and be charged. He knows that's not the case. He goes on to say, and if there are only 1 or 2 cases, of course, it would be more difficult to prove who was responsible for the assault. He gives there what the giveaway there is. The subtext of that is you needed to get all the ones that apply for one person, which is the foreknowledge that he had, which is why he chose those cases. He chose those deaths, he chose those crashes, not the 17 that he discounts. So he's saying there, you know, possibly charge someone, although if there was only 1 or 2 cases, of course, it would be more difficult to prove as responsible for the assault, because what you need is that graph with the ticks by Lucy Letby's name. You need that. You need the quantity allied to these ridiculous theories. What it amounts to in the end, all this fake clinical bollocks that he's talking about, all the crap theories that he's doing, unsubstantiated theories, which should have been ripped apart by experts, but from the defence, which weren't. They didn't even call one. What he's saying there is that the only way it's actually worked, in truth, is by getting a mass of them and allying them to those weak theories, and then overwhelming a jury emotionally with them. A couple of them on their own. He needed to have as many as he could. That it goes back to what he was supplying the police and that hospital with what they already knew in their minds, what they already suspected in their minds, which was that it's the Lucy Letby cases that we've been suspecting for 2 years. Just give us those, Evans. And he does. And there you've got your case. There you've got your case. And he's giving it away here. He says, I've got to drill down into this, because he says, if it was only 1 or 2 cases, it would be more difficult to prove who was responsible for the assault. Well, why is that then? I mean, if the theory holds, you should be able to... Well, if the theory holds, then you've got to be able to say, well, it is a crime. Who's responsible for the assault? Well, he's just completely, utterly wedded to the theory. If he finds it anywhere, it's got to be someone's fault. I think I've got everything I can out of that, because there's probably more anyway. And that the interviewer just finishes off just reiterating and says, oh, and the jury did convict her. Yeah, you did the job, Evans, you did the job. You got somebody innocent put in prison for life. Until the appeal, anyway. Until the appeal. And then she calls him a consultant paediatrician, which he's not, he's retired. Was never a neonatologist, by the way, said that before. And that's the end of that interview, and that's the last one I've done now for that Talk TV interview. That wraps that one up. There's something more about that last bit about if it was only 1 or 2 cases. I have to think about that more. But it just demonstrates that each individual case had nothing going for it in terms of the theory. It had to be allied to who's on shift across a series of 15 suspected cases. Suspected not by Evans initially, but by the consultants. Echoed by the police, ratified by Evans. They're all doing the same thing. And that's what creates this absolutely monstrous miscarriage of justice. And there was nothing to stop it, because the defence wasn't there to stop it. Not sufficiently at all. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye.